Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Janine D'Anibal, and I'm the Director of Trauma Services at Moving to End Sexual Assault, a team of mental health partners in Boulder, Colorado. Thanks for joining us this afternoon for our webcast of Locker Room Talk, talking about rape culture in 2016. Joining me is Camilo Cassis. Camilo is our Men's Standing Up Program Coordinator for Moving to End Sexual Assault. Hello. Good morning.
Hi. Thanks for coming in.
So, thank you for joining us. So, a bit first about Moving to End Sexual Assault. As I mentioned, MESA is the Rape Crisis Center that serves the Boulder, Broomfield counties, and we've been in existence since 1972. So, we were one of the third oldest rape crisis centers in the country, doing this work in both talking about preventing sexual violence, as well as providing services to survivors of sexual violence for a long time. And you'll notice that throughout our hour together today, our website information and our hotline number will scroll along the screen. So please feel free to take that information down. If at any time anything that we talk about today is upsetting, please feel free to use that hotline as a source of support or contact us through those numbers or through the website that we're showing on the screen. So first, just to be clear, as I mentioned, we're a program of Mental Health Partners, which is a private nonprofit community mental health center in Boulder. We're clearly a nonpartisan agency. And we're having this discussion about rape culture and locker room talk simply as experts in the field to lead the discourse on this issue as it's gained surprising prominence in this presidential election. And you can't open social media or look at the news or look at the newspaper without the words sexual assault, sexual harassment, rape culture being prominent. So our goal today is to weigh in on that, to talk a little bit, first of all, about what is rape culture. How does what is being talked about in the media impact victims who are victims of sexual assault or sexual abuse? And then what can we actually do, really concrete, practical strategies that you and me and Camilo, we can all do to make a dent into this pervasiveness of rape culture that allows, that is giving ground to this discussion that we're having today. So with that, we are going to be pretty candid in our discussion of some of the emerged in this political.
Accusations of sexism and misogyny are not new in our political space. I don't think there's ever been an election where someone hasn't been accused of those things. But there does seem to be something different about the current surge in sexual violence being an aspect of the presidential campaign. And I think either the behavior of one candidate or the behavior of the spouse of the other candidate have been brought to light, pointed out. But just to in the last 2-3 weeks, there was a snowball effect that was really triggered by an Associated Press article that looked specifically at Donald Trump's behavior on his reality TV show, The Apprentice. What that, of course, led to was Access Hollywood, who had interviewed Trump for many times, digging into some of their archival footage. And then, of course, that through that they discovered this notorious Boys on the Bus video, which we actually have, and we thought that just so that everyone is fully on board with the discussion that we're going to have, we should probably air. Now, this is triggering content for sure. So if you haven't seen it and you think that it might dig some things up, please take care of yourself. You can always call us if you'd like, But I think we're going to start by showing that video, if we have it lined up.
You know, and
She used to be great. She's still very beautiful.
I moved on her, actually. You know, she was down in Palm Beach. I moved on her, and I failed. I'll admit it.
Whoa.
I did try and fuck her. She was married.
Huge news, Sarah.
No, Nancy.
Yeah.
No, this was marriages. And I moved on her very heavily. In fact, I took her out furniture shopping. She wanted to get some furniture. I said, I'll show you where they have some nice furniture. I took her out furniture. I moved on her like a bitch, but I couldn't get there. And she was married. And all of a sudden, I see her. She's now got the big phony tits and everything. She's totally changed her look.
She's your girl's hot as shit. In the purple.
Whoa!
Yes!
Whoa!
Yes, the Donald has scored. Oh, my man. Wait, you gotta look at me when you get out of your
Remember
legs.
who sets this up.
That is very
You give me the thumbs
Look
up.
at you. You are a
You
piece.
gotta put the thumbs up. You gotta get the thumbs up.
Can't be too happy. First? Yeah, let me.
It's very
You
funny.
gotta give me the thumbs up.
You and I will walk down.
Oh my god.
Maybe it's a different one.
Better not be the publicist. No, it's her. It's
Yeah, that's it, with the gold. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. You can do anything.
Oh, look at those legs. All I can see is the legs.
No, it looks good.
Come on, shorty.
Oh, nice legs, huh?
Oof, get out of the way, honey. That's good legs. Go ahead.
It's always good if you don't fall out of the bus. Like Ford, Gerald Ford, remember?
There's a little down below. Pull the handle.
Hello, how are you? Hi.
Mr. Trump, how
nice
are
seeing
you?
you.
Pleasure to
Terrific.
meet you.
Terrific. You know Billy Bush?
How are
Nice
you?
to see you. How you doing,
Very
Ariane?
good.
I'm doing very well, thank you. Are you ready to be a soap star?
We're ready. Let's go. Make me a soap star.
How about a little hug
Absolutely.
for the Donald? He just got off the
Would
bus.
you like a little
Okay,
hug, darling?
absolutely.
How about a
Melania
little
said
hug for
this
the
was
bushy? I
okay.
just got off the bus.
Bushy, bushy.
There we go. Excellent. Well,
Come
you've
on.
got a nice co-star here.
Good.
Yes, absolutely.
After you. Come on, Billy. Don't be shy.
As soon as a beautiful woman shows up, he takes
Get over
off
here,
on
Billy.
this. Always happens.
I'm sorry, come here.
Let the little guy in there. Come
Yeah,
on.
let the little guy in. How you feel now, better? I should actually.
It's hard to walk next to a guy
Here,
like
wait,
this.
hold on.
Yeah, you get in the middle. There we go.
Good. That's
This is
better.
much better. This is.
That's better.
Now, if you had to choose, honestly, between one of us, me or the Donald, who
I
would
don't
it
know.
be?
That's
That's
tough
some pressure right
competition.
there.
Yeah.
Seriously, you had to take one of us as a date.
I have to take a fifth on that one.
Really?
Yep, I'll take both.
Which way?
Make it right. Here we go. Goodbye. Right of the days.
Here he goes. I'm gonna leave you here.
Okay.
Get my microphone.
Okay. You gonna? Oh, you're finished?
You're my man. Yeah.
Oh, good.
I'm gonna go do our show.
Oh, you want to reset? Okay.
Okay, so if you hadn't seen it, you've seen it now, and we're all up to speed. Of course, Trump's response to this and the response of his campaign is the now infamous line, this was just an instance of locker room talk, which is the kind of boys will be boys excuse that we often find in instances where rape culture is manifested. The denial that he had ever acted on that talk came a couple days after the release of this video during the second presidential debate, when he was pressed by Anderson Cooper if, one, he recognized that what he was referring to was sexual violence, which he also denied, and second, whether he'd ever acted upon it, which he made a blanket claim that he'd never ever done anything to that effect. What this triggered was, in the last few days, a flurry of newspaper articles where women who were watching the debate and listened to his categorical denial have been coming out to the New York Times. There's a People writer, People magazine writer. BuzzFeed had someone. The Palm Beach newspaper had one, and there seems to be kind of a dam break now of acceptability to speak out on possible instances, alleged instances of sexual harassment and sexual assault. Currently, there are 7 accusers. They are Natasha Stoyanov, Rachel Crooks, Mindy McIlvray, Cassandra Searles, Temple Taggart, Jill Harth. And these are real people who have real consequences to be coming out and speaking about this. We don't know if they're all true, if any of them are true. As a organization that works with survivors of sexual violence, we start from a stance of believing. But regardless of the case, we thought it would be important to humanize some of these. So we have a quick testimony from Jessica Leeds, who was one of the women who came forward in the New York Times article.
Can I even say,
Yeah, please.
jump in with something, Camilla? Not only does it humanize, I think, by giving the names, but also to acknowledge the level of bravery that every time a person comes forward and puts their name to an allegation, to a claim of sexual assault, it's my personal belief that it's a act of bravery. It's really quite heroic, given the potential for backlash, given the potential for victim blaming. So I think that it's not without risk that people come forward, and so to just acknowledge that.
Absolutely.
These are not memories that you want to go over. It's been somewhat unnerving since Friday to be rehashing it so many times. You suppress it. It's not part of your active thinking every day, but you don't forget. It was over 35 years ago. I was hired by a newsprint company. I was a sales rep. I was traveling in the Middle West. I was coming back into New York City, and it was on that flight that the stewardess asked me would I like to move up to first class. I didn't need to be asked twice, and I sat down next to a young man, blonde, tall, and he introduced himself as Donald Trump. I was not really aware of the real estate world of Trump. We just chatted back and forth, nothing particular. It wasn't until they cleared the meal that somehow or another the armrest in the seat disappeared, and it was a real shock when all of a sudden his hands were all over me. He started encroaching on my space, and I hesitate to use this expression, but I'm going to, and that is, he was like an octopus. It was like he had 6 arms. He was all over the place. And if he had stuck with the upper part of the body, I might not have gotten that upset. But it's when he started putting his hand up my skirt, and that was it. That was it. I was out of there. And I don't think I said a word. During the late 60s, 70s, and into the 80s, culture had instilled in us that somehow it was our fault. The attention that we received from men, that we were responsible for their behavior. You didn't complain to the authorities, you didn't complain to your boss. If something happened to you, you just bucked up and you went on. I thought to myself, gee, I wish the stewardess would come and rescue me. And then I decided, I got up, I got my purse, and I said, I'm going back to my seat and coach. I was so glad to get back to that seat. I started telling my story about 1.5 years ago when it became apparent that Trump was actually running for president. And I started telling my friends, let me tell you what this guy is all about. I would like to think that sharing this story would make a difference both in the election and in society's view of women, to change some of the behavior, the sexual behavior between men and women in both directions. And I would like very much to feel like I've been a part of that.
Now, it is important that we mention that Donald Trump and his campaign have vociferously, categorically denied all of these accusations. They've claimed that they're all instances of false accusation, and he has threatened to sue for libel all of the media outlets that have given prominence to these claims. It's also worth pointing out that it hasn't only exclusively been Trump's words and his alleged behavior that has injected this issue into the campaign and given it the exposure that it currently has in the campaign, of course. The Trump campaign has also raised issues of Hillary Clinton's husband's past behavior, as well as her behavior towards women from their past. So this is, in some sense, is a bipartisan controversy, and the rape culture that we will be discussing can be found and is on display throughout our culture, not just on the left, not just on the right, not just amongst professional politicians, but this is a pervasive reality. Now, as we kind of discuss this media interest in this issue, I think the most important place to start is to discuss the impact that this has on past survivors of sexual violence. And really, Janine is one of the best equipped people on earth to talk about that. So I was wondering if you could maybe reflect on that.
Yeah, sure. And before I get into that, just a reminder that we have up on the screen a number where you could text in any questions or comments, and that we could take either throughout if they're relevant, or at the end we'll have some time hopefully for some question and answer. But I do want to talk a little bit. Well, first of all, I feel like it has been a difficult week, and never in my lifetime, or I think in our movement's lifetime, have we seen the issue of the discussion of sexual assault so front and center. And there's some potential upside to that, even though it's been such a horrific time in some ways. It does open the conversation, but one of the potential negative impacts is what this has meant for other sexual assault survivors out there, who have been what we call potentially re-traumatized by these events. So I think all of us, no matter what our histories, can certainly relate to being upset or offended or worried about maybe some things that have taken place. But I think for sex assault survivors in particular, it's what we call a very triggering or potentially re-traumatizing time, right? And why is that? Well, one, you're talking about sex assault in arenas maybe you don't really, you're not really prepared for that topic to really be discussed in. For example, turning on the evening news and it being front and center of the lead story about sexual aggression toward women. Or you tune into the debate and that is a huge line of the questioning. So it can catch people off guard. And the fact that these people that you mentioned, Camilo, in question are arguably, they're running for the most powerful office in the world, arguably, right? So that can bring up feelings of people who have been assaulted or abused by other people in positions of power, who then have been able to act with this sense of impunity for their behavior, right? Where there either weren't consequences, or the events themselves were minimized, or, as you said, Camilo, even denied, right? Mm-hmm. Even denied. So I think those are the recipes for what we call a triggering or an activating, a re-traumatizing event for many survivors. So just yesterday, unfortunately, our therapist here at Moving to End Sexual Assault had 2 clients that she had finished a course of treatment with recontact her, asking to come back in for another course of treatment because they were so re-stimulated and re-traumatized by the events. And I'm sure that's common across the country right now. So I think, one of the potential positives, as I mentioned, that has come out of this, though, is this idea of a social awareness and people actually talking about the issue and coming forward on it. For instance, the hashtag #NotOK campaign that has been going on Twitter, which came from a woman, I believe, who started this was it in response to?
Yeah, it was in response to
Trump's first.
She shared her first experience with sexual harassment and asked anyone else out there to share theirs.
Yeah.
And I think it's
At last count, I think it was up to 30 million men and women have shared their own experience of being sexually assaulted. And we knew these numbers. I mean, it doesn't surprise us that these numbers are high, but I, even today, in reviewing the notes for this, I had to pause and say 30 million people. And those are just the people sharing their stories, right? So it just speaks to the pervasiveness of this, and a potential side effect that there is a unity among sex assault survivors that perhaps hasn't been like this in a while. You're going to say something?
well, I was going to say we have a question that's come in specifically that's relevant
Oh,
to
good.
this,
Okay.
which is how do I approach survivors who have been triggered?
Well, I think first it's making the connection between sometimes just normalizing and validating why someone might be triggered is the first step. It makes perfect sense that people who have a sex assault, sex abuse history would be triggered in this environment, right? Again, we're seeing a person in power, denying, minimizing, and then acting with impunity. So it's a perfect replication of likely a lot of scenarios of abuse, right? So that's the first step, to normalize and to validate. And second is supportive listening without judgment, without blame, okay? And then the next piece is to make sure that they're referred to an expert agency like Moving to End Sexual Assault or mental health partners that can then deal with the trauma-specific treatment, would be my response to that. Do you have anything you want to add to that?
No, I think that's
Okay. Okay, good. Another thing I want to mention, just as we're talking about survivors, is to realize this speaks to this issue that sex assault is not a one-time acute traumatic event, but it's an event that people can continue to experience over the course of their lifetime that can be remembered, re-experienced through exactly what we're experiencing now. So it just speaks to the complexity of the trauma. It's not something that someone is necessarily over, but it has the potential to kind of come up in a chronic way, so that more support might be needed. And it could also feel demoralizing to survivors of feeling like, well, that happened to me 10 years ago or 30 years ago. I should be over it by now. And that's not the case at all. That's not the way trauma works in the brain. And unfortunately, when we have a perfect storm of potential triggering events like we do in this case, we have a national stage, we have global media, social media, it can lead to triggering events for sure. So yeah, if you have more questions on survivors or any aspect of that, please feel free to text us and we can speak to that. But let's now really get into the heart of what we want to talk about is, why is this even happening in the first place? What is creating locker room talk? How does that build and grow and feed rape culture? And Camilo is the best person to lead us through that.
Sure. So, sexual violence doesn't occur in a vacuum. There is a cultural basis and a social basis to any act of violence. And with regards to sexual violence, we have a concept called rape culture. To understand and interpret beliefs, attitudes, cultural assumptions that normalize, trivialize, excuse, condone, or even deny that sexual violence exists and that it occurs. And the rape culture lens is extremely relevant and useful to understanding and interpreting both what has triggered this conversation and in really understanding how these aren't just benign statements that were made. These have very real-world impacts in shaping how people who hear those comments understand sexual violence is occurring or whether it even does occur. So, some examples of rape culture, and again, rape culture, it's attitudes and beliefs that are shared and that are propagated through our communities that trivialize rape, that normalize rape, that excuse rape, that deny rape, that condones rape. So, a classic example of that would just be a rape joke. So, making a joke that makes light of sexual violence, that perhaps plays on whether consent is necessary for sexual contact, plays on as to, you know, whether someone may actually enjoy non-consensual sexual contact. These kind of memes out there, these kind of jokes, while they sometimes seem harmless, and they may seem harmless to many, and part of that perception that they're benign is because how widespread they are. But they actually function to normalize that behavior for the majority of sexual violence is committed by men. So for the minority of men that commit sexual violence, who make up the majority of all perpetrators, it normalizes their behavior. So another example of sexual culture would just be the objectification of women. And really it's the objectification of all people, the projection of one's sense of entitlement on someone else's body. This is another hallmark of rape culture that I think has been very much on display in the last, with this campaign and the behavior of one of the candidates. Not just his behavior in the context of this campaign, but his whole lifetime of proclamations and kind of just the attitude that he has about women specifically, either denigrating them for not being desirable or for taking some kind of pleasure in ranking and talking about them as objects. And then, of course, another aspect of rape culture is victim blaming, which is the projection of responsibility for one, the prevention of a sexual assault onto the potential group of victims, and then if a sexual assault does occur, the standard narratives that tend to emerge and that are very deeply embedded. I work in this field. My job is to disabuse people of those kind of assumptions, and yet I even catch myself falling into those kind of thoughts when I hear about a sex assault, and it just speaks to how deeply entrenched these narratives around this particular crime are, that for some reason, well, maybe someone should have done something to avoid being assaulted. And then, of course, another aspect of this is the denial of sexual violence, the denial of the myth of the false accusation. This is a very common belief out there that a significant plurality or even majority of claims of sexual violence are actually lies for some ends. In this context that we're talking about, there are obvious political consequences to those accusations, and so they are going to be claimed to be false. I think you can speak to how common false accusations actually are, and when one understands the consequences of coming out as a survivor of sexual violence, it would be very unlikely to do so. Unless it was real.
Well, and the statistics really say that it's about between 2 and 8% of reported sex assault claims actually turn out to be true false reports. So, meaning they just were true, they were made up. And that is actually less than any other felony level crime. So less than any burglary reports or fraud, some kind of fraud reports. That the false report of sex assault is actually less than any felony level crime. Yet, one of the first things that when someone comes forward with it is she making it up? Or, why didn't she come forth before, which actually, I know, I don't want to derail you on your rape culture piece, but which made me think of one of the persons that have come forward now in a very public way to one of the candidates here, from one of the candidates, is that she actually, that survivor actually, an incident happened where she was groped and forcibly kissed and and then she went back and told her place of business, which was People magazine, that this happened. And what did People magazine do? People magazine ran the story that she was covering, which was of Trump and his honeymoon and his new wedding, right?
Yeah.
So I think what that is it's an institutional kind of denial of, okay, that happened to you. You need to go deal with that on your own. We're going to run our story, which sends the message of, once again, impunity, right? No consequences, and somehow that report that it didn't matter. So all of that, whether it be accusations of false reporting or in that case, like almost a minimization, feeds rape culture.
Yes, yes. And the consequence of that aspect of rape culture is the extremely low rates of charges being brought, of claims being filed, for every form of sexual harassment and sexual assaults.
Yep.
So, another, and just to kind of riff a bit more on rape culture, another dimension of it is the use of language associated with sexual violence in a diminished or lightened manner. And I think that's another example that we've seen on ample display over the last year of campaigning. So, for example, the use of rape as China's raping us. That has, well, one, it taps into a male anxiety, but we don't need to get into that right now.
It's another webcast.
Yeah, for sure. But it cheapens the language that we use to describe rape, and that serves to trivialize it and to a certain extent normalize it further. So we want to spend a moment now, though. We've kind of presented what rape culture is and some instances of it, to really look now at that one reference point that everyone is using, which we did show, and that was the video of the candidate from 2005. It is 11 years old, and how we can unpack that and interpret it and analyze it, both to demonstrate very graphic instance of rape culture, but then also to see how rape culture gets propagated. And since you all watched the video just now, in it you have someone first speaking in a very objectified manner about a woman, kind of having a very callous attitude about an attempted sexual conquest. And that's definitely on the spectrum of what we would consider rape culture. But then it just gets cranked up to like an 11 when he starts to talk about the privileges that his entitlement as, and though maybe he didn't have the self-awareness to frame it this way, but that he possesses as a rich, famous, white, cisgendered man, essentially. And he was reveling, celebrating the privilege implicit in that, where he actually has agency over women's bodies, or he perceives that he has his agency over their bodies, that he can, quote, do whatever he wants, that if he sees a beautiful woman, he just has to kiss her, so he always has to be prepared with Tic Tacs, he's just going to kiss her. And then where he takes it is that he says he as you saw, that he can touch them and do as he pleases with their bodies in that presence. So these are all very clear instances of statements, concepts, memes that we would categorize as rape culture. But for me, one of the most, and I hear that all the time, I work with men, I point that out all the time with men, but what I found particularly fascinating is that there were 6, 7, 8 men on that bus with him who are hearing this. And this really gets to the crux of why rape culture exists today. Because we know, based on attitudinal surveys, and there's a great deal of sociology and sociopsychology research on this, that the majority of all people, but specifically the majority of men, actually hold what we would categorize as pro-social attitudes and beliefs about sexual violence, about consent, about sexual harassment. And the majority of men, 70 to 80% of men, throughout any generation, are uncomfortable with these kind of statements. I can definitely testify to this through my anecdotal work with men of all ages on this topic area. Most men find it unpleasant to repugnant when they hear people talk about this, and yet equally, most men remain silent when they hear this. Most people remain silent when they hear these kind of comments. And while silence might make one feel that they're not participating in it, the message that silence sends is that it's a green light. Silence is perceived by people who make these kind of comments as a green light, not just to make those comments, but more implicitly to participate in that kind of behavior. So we need to unpack why is it that we have the majority of people, the majority of men on that bus probably found it inappropriate language, and yet they didn't say anything. Now, this is kind of an extreme example because you have a billionaire celebrity making these comments, and there's just inherent power dynamics that would make speaking up difficult and potentially
Correct, but it's all
difficult for your
relative,
career.
right?
Yeah.
I mean, because it could be on an athletic team that the coach is making that comment, right?
Yes.
So it
Yeah.
may not be at the,
Yeah.
not a billionaire,
Yeah.
but it's still a person in the position of power
Yeah.
over.
Or
Relative
most
to the other people.
popular person in your friendship group who everyone loves is making that comment. So there are reasons. There's fear of compromising a relationship. In the masculine cultures that dominate, there might be fears to being like that raising those issues might challenge your sexuality, which is which we conflate as a marker of masculinity in our culture. We can definitely get into that a little bit, or the fear of being perceived as being gay or being weak or not being sexually vital in some sense, and that those anxieties actually reduce the likelihood that someone will speak up. But another phenomena that comes into play is what is known as the bystander paradox, and we don't really have time to get too much into it, but the basic phenomena of the bystander paradox is it's a sociology concept where if a event is occurring, an antisocial event is occurring, but it's being observed by, the greater the number of the observers, the lesser the likelihood that any one of those observers will actually intervene to stop it occurring.
Yeah.
And of course, the Kitty Genovese case is the bedrock of this, theoretically. But we also see this in terms of in instances of like cultural violence, language violence, which I think is on display in that bus. It is worth mentioning this just in case that what was described is unequivocally sexual assault. I think that there can be no obfuscation of that. I mean, there's no jurisdiction in this country where what was described on that it would not be considered. Grabbing someone's genitals would not be an instance of a sexual contact, and if it wasn't consented to.
Correct.
So why is it the men don't speak up in those instances? It's because they don't realize that they are in the majority, that their pro-social attitudes and beliefs are actually shared by the majority of men on that bus, and that if just one of them spoke up, there's a good chance that that they would have the rest behind them. And so therein lies really the target, the objective of my work, certainly, trying to work with rape culture and masculinity. It's getting men to feel empowered and then equipping them with strategies to push back on those kind of behaviors and those kind of speech behaviors. And even though that might seem somewhat trivial, just to call someone out for something being uncomfortable, for saying something that they find uncomfortable, we know also from psychology research that it can have profound impacts on actual behaviors. So people who are serial sex offenders or serial sexual harassers, they tend to share a constellation of character traits. These include a general lack of empathy, a belief in, a deeply held belief in sexism, in a hierarchy of sexes, and what we call misogyny. They tend to have a strong sense of entitlement, and those are characteristics that are very difficult to intervene on, unless you happen to be their therapist or something. But there's a fourth characteristic that's entirely shared by all serial repeat sex offenders and sexual harassers, and that is they have a perceived approval of their behavior from their male peer group. And so they think that what they do is actually endorsed by the men in their life. And really, that is the genesis of the rape comment, of the rape joke. It's seeking approval, seeking to normalize a behavior that at some level might be intuited as being wrong, but putting it out there in an all-male environment to see how they respond. And if a couple, laugh heartily, and I think Billy Bush is certainly played that role, and then the rest remain silent, that is a tacit endorsement of that behavior. Mm-hmm. So really the crux of intervening with rape culture is just doing that. Intervening with rape culture is understanding what it is when it is said or spoken, or you see a commercial about it, or you see it in a movie. Being able to identify it, and then having the sense of agency to call it out.
And I would just imagine that maybe, I don't know, I think for myself and maybe for people listening, what do you actually say? What are the what do you say?
It's difficult. And it always will depend on the situation. Definitely, if someone who I'm close with would say something like that, I'm going to feel a lot more comfortable being very candid and direct.
Yeah.
But you can do all kinds of verbal aikido to soften the blow to the person. But it might even be something as simple as, listen, I have a very close friend, a sibling, my partner, my mother was directly impacted by what you're talking about. Please don't say that in front of me. Please don't talk about that in front of me. That kind of personalizing it might be one way to lessen the defensiveness that it might trigger. Mm-hmm. And even if it does trigger defensiveness, though, I just want to stress, there's a very good chance that person is long term going to be incorporating and integrating that pushback into their attitudes and beliefs. I think perhaps one of the reasons why Donald Trump, on the surface, again, we can't adjudicate this, we can just observe and interpret given our expertise, but on the surface he does seem to have these very deeply held rape cultural beliefs and attitudes. I think that he's uniquely a person who never gets pushed back, and has had almost his entire life, and certainly for the last few decades, has seldom, if ever, been called out on anything he's said or done, let alone these things. So it's in a
Well, you could even argue that most men in power aren't.
True, very true. And
Yeah.
it's not to excuse that
Yeah.
behavior in the slightest, but to understand it with towards the end of changing it.
Mm-hmm.
It's not surprising that the most powerful have the most strongly held beliefs in this. So I think we're going to shift over to some questions.
Yeah, some amazing questions have been coming in. So, and you're actually just speaking to this now. I mean, how can you stop enabling behavior like that of Billy Bush on the bus?
Mhm.
Billy Bush on the bus. It doesn't. That's not a good alliteration, but you know
Yeah,
that,
well,
that's what you're
Billy Bush
speaking to.
definitely jumped in there and,
Yep.
and kind of egged it on. And you know, I working with male groups, you do see that there's this 10-15% of men who really deeply hold on to these beliefs, and an aspect of that might be that they have behaved in those manners, have done actions like that before, and so they latch on to when it comes up to
Yeah.
normalize it.
Yeah.
But again, just I think to be vulnerable and ask that those kind of things aren't spoken around, and you know there will be times that you're going to be ostracized for it, but if your discomfort or your compromise of a relationship prevents a sexual assault from occurring, it's a pretty straightforward cost benefit. From my point of view, a bit of awkwardness, you know, can prevent violence from occurring.
Yeah. Here's one more on rape culture, and then we can kind of shift gears a little bit. How about the use of the word sexual conquest as another example of rape culture?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Again, yeah, objectifying.
Objectifying. It's not sexual activity in a consensual relational
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, and we're just scratching the surface to really understand rape culture. You need to understand masculinity, or masculinities that exist out there, and understand how they're created, how they're propagated, why they are propagated, and controversially, we need to understand that the cultural phenomenon of masculinity is resonating with deeply embedded behaviors.
Yeah.
But we don't have time for that right
Yeah.
now.
Yeah.
But definitely you can see that in the language that men use around sex as opposed to the language that women use around sex.
Yep. This is an interesting question. It starts to get a little political, but I won't. But there's an element of the question that I think is good. If Trump's been clearly kind of demonstrating sex assault, why hasn't the Republican Party disowned him? And what does it say when an entire political party promotes rape culture? Well, I would even respond to that by saying, yes, I think there's some accountability that, you know, they continue to endorse him as a candidate, but I would even argue that even goes beyond the party. I think, and this isn't going to be popular, but I think we all promote rape culture to some extent. Like, we're all on the hook for this.
Yeah.
Regardless of our political affiliation, I think we have all created this, and maybe it's been in some less egregious ways, and we don't necessarily go around talking about our sexual conquests, but it could be something as simple as, you know, minimizing survivors' experience, right? Or, you know, there's other ways that we promote a culture where it's not taken seriously. So I'd caution us from thinking it's as easy as separating into political parties, because I think it's much more complex.
Yeah, and let's not lose sight of the 90s and what occurred on the presidential stage then. And I think that, there's cognitive dissonance can be a real thing on these spaces, and we will adopt and adapt narratives that allow us to not maybe confront violence that we are implicitly condoning.
Yeah. Some of these are good. You know, how do you reason with people who people like Trump or someone who is sexist and misogynist? I mean, it is a good question. I mean, if someone is really firmly, as you were saying, entrenched in their beliefs, how do you get in there? How do you get in that?
Yeah.
I'm curious about your answer here because
Sure. So you may not be able to in your interaction. What you can try to do is leave them with an articulation of your distaste that they're inevitably going to ruminate on. People will present that they don't care what you say, but it will work in there, especially if more and more people say it. But if you really want to get into, and for example, when I work with men who just clearly are deeply entrenched misogyny and rape culture, you to a certain extent you need to validate that experience, and that's not easy with something as unpleasant as this.
That's right.
But there's a degree to which you need to validate their how they came to inhabit their worldview, and push back on it delicately, and then ultimately request that they somewhat alter their behavior, so they don't say something like that in front of you again, or they don't say that again to anyone. But it's not a single interaction that can change some of these things, but it's the cumulative effect. But we all have an agency in those little single moments.
Yep. Does a lack of support from other women have any concrete impact on survivors of sex assault or rape? So that's interesting, that I think sometimes women are hardest on other women, right? And I think it's this social psychology phenomena with this idea of like, if I don't believe your experience as another woman, as a fellow woman, that I can look at what you did or didn't do, so I can somehow distance myself from you. So maybe I don't have to look at what may happen to me or what did happen to me. So sometimes women can be particularly rough on other women. Does it have a worse effect to not be supported by a woman than another man? I don't know necessarily. I think that, but we have to start changing that narrative to not minimize any experiences, including our own. Starting in our own, and particularly, this isn't the question, but I'll speak to it, as we talk also about male survivors. Most of the time we've talked about, in a majority of the cases, we have male offenders, right? But we have to remember that both men and women can be victims, and a small percentage are female sex offenders too. It certainly does happen. It's a small percentage, but men are survivors too, boys and men. And we have to remember too that it's interesting. Here's an interesting analysis: is that when boys were the victim of sexual assault and targeted, like I think about in the cases of the Penn State case, when boys were targeted, or the altar boys, the boys in the Catholic Church with Catholic priests, or then it was clearly seen as hierarchy of male violence against other men. But then when it's a male violence against other women, it's seen as this blurry, well, was that consensual, and did the victim somehow ask for it, or was the victim behaving seductively? We have a kind of a sexist analysis in that dynamic. So just something to think about.
Yeah, and also an aspect of rape culture we've kind of been getting to is what's called toxic masculinity or unhealthy masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity is another example of it. And these are forms of masculinity that basically ensure male dominance in our culture. And an aspect of that dominance is male entitlement to the female body. But the culture of toxic masculinity isn't only propagated by men. Women can also be responsible for reproducing those kinds of beliefs of what it is to be a man, and beliefs of how it is to behave as a man. And so no, it's definitely, all genders need to be involved in addressing this, though I do personally believe that men have a greater role, certainly.
And we're almost out of time, Camilo, and I apologize because there's amazing text coming in. So maybe we'll find another forum or part 2 of this to continue taking some questions, because those are fantastic. But there's a couple questions about kids and talking to kids. How do we reach people to make them understand that for younger people in middle and high schools to speak up when they feel uncomfortable given social pressures and teen social behavior? So, I don't know, but, I think a lot of this, there's a couple of different ways to approach it, is teaching about body positivity, and that about to have pride and not shame in bodies, and that also our bodies are something that deserve to be respected, and only shared with consent and respect, and touched with care and consent. Young. It's never too young to start having those types of conversations.
And they're not sexualized. They don't need to be sexualized angles on it.
Right.
Just talking about the autonomy that you have over your body, that it's your body, and that other people's bodies are their bodies, and that you can't do anything to their body if they haven't said you can.
And if you do stuff to their body, that there's
You're
consequences.
gonna get in trouble.
And sometimes very, very big ones.
Yeah. And I would also just mention that Mesa, we do work in middle school and high schools, and talking precisely about these issues, and really that is the stage to intervene.
Yeah.
Or even earlier.
Yeah, and along those lines, in the spirit of wrapping up, so first of all, thank you for staying with us, and for your great participation. If you're interested in finding out more about what Mesa does, or perhaps to have Camilo, I'm offering you.
Oh,
Here.
sure.
Okay. To have Camilo,
I
yeah, he's consenting. Give a similar presentation of this to your work group, to your community, to work with him on the work he does in the schools. That's why he's here. So he can be reached through Moving to End Sexual Assault. And then likely just to remind people that Mesa does offer a 24-hour hotline. We offer group and individual counseling services to survivors of sexual assault, and to family and friends who are secondary survivors, of how to support loved ones. And we do offer other alternative things like trauma-informed yoga and mindfulness groups to also help manage the trauma, and all of us maybe to get through this election season.
Yeah.
Right?
We also take volunteers
Thank
to
you.
work on the client side or the prevention side, and finally, we
Brave Bold
we
Blue.
rely on our community to support our work. It's very important work. It's underfunded work everywhere.
Yeah.
And we have a upcoming fundraiser.
We do. Upcoming fundraiser. This is a great time to come out against rape culture at our Brave, Bold, and Beautiful event, which is November 10th. So 2 days after the election, and find out more at movingtoendsexualassault.org.